Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We have with you a very exciting panel and to talk about reforms in China, growing pains for a global power. Reforms in any system requires massive adjustment for the stakeholders, and even in a mature and stable society like the United States, we only have to recall the painful process of achieving equal rights for different races, for the gender, which lasts for decades. And observing from outside the US, the process of achieving compromise on providing affordable health care in the United States informs us of the degree of adjustments that really have to be made. Well, China's reform of its economic system and social structure is no different. It cannot be achieved by fiat from the central government because not even the Chinese Communist Party is a monolithic power anymore. Stakeholders' interests have to be accommodated to make genuine progress. So what we will ask the panel this afternoon is to unpack for us what is it that reforms in China can achieve, the price it has to pay, and we will focus our discussions on the economy and developments in the Chinese political system. We're very happy to have people who have come in from Beijing as well as Hong Kong, but Professor Pei has come from a much shorter distance from Claremont. You're a neighbor.
Yes.
But I don't know, driving on the LA freeway can sometimes be much tougher than flying 18 hours. Well, we have Dr. Ha Jiming, Chief Investment Strategist and Vice Chairman of Goldman's Investment Management Unit for China, based in Hong Kong. Dr. Ha was the Chief Economist of China International Capital Corporation, or CICC, the first joint venture investment bank in China, before he left for Goldman's. Next to Dr. Ha is Mr. Huang Shan, the international editor of Caixin Media. Mr. Huang was one of a group of journalists who famously joined his chief editor in 2009 to leave the influential Caixin magazine to form this new economic and business magazine called Caixin. Caixin is now regarded as the new benchmark for Chinese media with its forthright reporting and writing. On my left is Professor Pei Mingxin from Claremont McKenna College. Professor Pei's expertise on governance in China, on US-China relations, is well known to the American audience from his frequent contributions to the New York Times, to Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, China Quarterly on CNN, and National Public Radio. And on the left is Mr. Zhang Lifen, the honorary founding editor of Financial Times Chinese.com, and currently still one of its columnists. This ftchinese.com is an important website in the Chinese language, giving access to the Chinese bureaucracy and academics, access to views from outside of China, and for his pains, many of the articles have also been blanked out in China. But that's ftchinese.com, and it is still a very important news source in China. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for joining us today, and thank you, audience, for being with us this afternoon. I would like to start, perhaps, by asking Huang Shan. Let me start with you. You know, we read a lot about the slowdown in China. From the heyday of the double-digit growth, it's now 6%, maybe less. Numbers can be argued about. But when you report on the Chinese economy and business, what does this slowdown mean to business and to employment in China?
Thank you, Mr. Chang. First of all, I would say Now, there's the buzzword about the new normal, talking about the economic slowdown will be continued for a long period of time. But I would argue that the new normal is not that new, because actually we have seen the unsustainability of economic slowdown just before the financial crisis. But I think signs included, for example, the reduce the rates of productivity, and also the rate of wage increase rate exceeded that of the productivity. So I think we have seen a lot of slowdown signs before the new administration. But as we have seen that now, a lot of business realize that it will be a long-term phenomenon. That means you must adapt yourself to the new normal. And you must come up with new measures and new policies to deal with the overall slowdown of the economy. That means we must rely upon more on the innovation and the creativity, and we encourage more people to have entrepreneurship. That means you can rely upon the old investment-driven and export-led growth model. You must rely upon the consumption-driven and also the creativity-driven economic growth model. So I think everybody realizes this is a fact on the ground. You have no choice but to adapt yourself to a new reality. I think now we have seen a wave of entrepreneurship, in China. A lot of young people, I think the good sign is that a lot of young people don't choose to enroll as we call public servants examinations. Quite often they choose to start up their new business. They're trying to join the private sector. I think this represents a very, very good signs for the Chinese transformation, great transformation.
But it is not something that the Chinese government can do anything to encourage, because it's already happening.
I think if you we just combine the forces of public sector and the private sector. Now, as you may be aware that Chinese new government, they just launch a broad range of measures trying to simplify the registration process for new startups, for new business, and also allow the people to lower tax rate and a lower tax burden for new business, and trying to put in place a lot of pilot projects. For example, the Shanghai free zone, free trade zone, and a lot of pilot projects in terms of financial and fiscal reform in different areas. I think combine this and with the entrepreneurship of the private sector, so you can see quite a lot of China observers and the China watchers. They hold guarded optimism about the economic transformation of a Chinese state.
Thank you. Timing, has this slowdown actually affected the appetite of the investors from outside of China looking for investments in China? Because if the economy is slowing down, is this a good place to invest? And also whether there's an appetite among the Chinese businesses to go into the capital markets to raise funds in order to expand their business?
Yeah. Let me first talk a bit about the slowdown. I think the slowdown could be more significant than the numbers seem to suggest. If we look at this chart, for example, I here want to point out the discrepancies between China's GDP figure with other important economic indicators. For example, in the past 1.5 decades, 2 decades actually, China's GDP growth averaged at about 9.5%, when power consumption also grew by an average of 9%. So these are more or less the same growth rate. But in the first quarter of this year, the officially reported GDP growth was as high as 7%. However, power consumption fell by 0.1%. So this is a kind of a anomaly that we saw from the data. And also on government revenue, usually government revenue grow about 20% compared to a 10% nominal GDP growth. But this time around, we saw revenue grew only 3.7%, but GDP still grew by 7%. And if we can look at the next chart, chart 3, again, I here use another micro-level indicator, that's the railway freight, which was about half of the growth rate of GDP, but this time it is falling by 9%, but GDP still 7%. Finally, real estate investment used to grow by 25% compared to a 9 or 10% GDP growth in China, but this time real estate growth fell to 8%, but still GDP is 7%. So all this I want to show is I think actually the economy could be growing at a much slower pace than the official 7% rate. But back to your question, two-way investment. I still see some external investors investing in China because of the monetary easing that is taking place in China. Looking at the monetary policy in the past 6 months, we found that the PBOC, or Central Bank of China, has cut interest rates twice and also lowered the reserve requirement ratio twice, pumping liquidity into the market. That sort of helped the market rally in the recent months. And given that China's large companies, Disco's valuation is still not very rich, people expect there are rooms for further increase in China's equity prices. I think that's the main reason that foreigners are still investing in the Chinese market. And there are also capital outflows, outward investment from China. Because I'm in Goldman dealing with many of the high net worth individual clients in China, I found that an increasing number of China's high net worth individuals are more interested in diversifying their assets away from China and toward the rest of the world in different asset classes. For example, more clients are interested in buying properties here in this country or in London, in Australia, and also a significant number of them are diversifying away from China's liquid assets toward the rest of the world. They invest in European stocks, they invest in US stocks, they also invest in some other, like even foreign exchange, foreign currency products. So I see the cross-border investment is going to increase in the next few years because China is gradually opening its capital account by allowing more outflows and at the same time more inflows. So we have already seen the Hong Kong-Shanghai stock link that started last November, and hopefully this year sometime we're going to see a Shenzhen-Shanghai stock link being established. Furthermore, we're going to see QDII earmarked for individuals. As many of you know that right now China's qualified institutional investors are allowed to invest abroad subject to a quota, but this is not for individuals. But in the future, I guess China will also open a channel for individuals to invest abroad as well. Yeah.
If you have an interest in the outward bound investment from China, may I do an advertisement for a panel tomorrow, in fact, discussing this very question of outward bound investment from China. Professor Pei, now we look at China and the United States. In a way, these are the two really big players in the world. Should America be pleased that China's economy is slowing, or is there something that America should be concerned about?
I would say the US should be both pleased and worried. If you view China as a threat, as a military threat, as an economic threat, then you should be pleased because economic slowdown, and this is most likely to be structural, not cyclical. That will mean that China will have a lot less resources to finance its military modernization and to finance huge development projects such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to compete with the US for influence. And if you are ideologically inclined and you view that China's success as a one-party regime using state capitalism for economic development, that model finally is unraveling, then you should be pleased as well. But of course, those who are worried include those who do business with China, those who invest in China, those who source from China, and those who rely on China for other things. Because the slowdown clearly will mark a huge change in future projections of profitability and so on and so forth. But I think I think the mainstream should be both worried, should be pleased and worried. That is pleased in the sense that China has long engaged in an unsustainable economic development model. This has been raised by various people, from very high American officials to academics like us, for a long time. And the Chinese government has consistently ignored such warning on the ground that we're doing very well. So finally, the slowdown actually shows, if nothing else, that the model China has pursued for the last 20 years or so is unsustainable. And this gives the Chinese government an opportunity to engage in painful reforms. That's why you should be pleased. The worry comes from that, what if China misses this opportunity? And at the moment, we actually do not see convincing signs that China is aggressively addressing the underlying structural problems that's these problems are holding the Chinese economy back. So the worry comes from those about China's inability to seize this rare opportunity, which comes in the disguise of not necessarily a crisis, of a serious problem.
Li-Fen, I want to pursue this question on the economic slowdown, because very often journalists will write about a hard landing in China. What is a hard landing? And what will it feel like in China, and then outside of China when there is one?
Thank you, Win. I think this is a very difficult question, and I think we journalists have been talking about hard landing in China for many years. I think at least for the past 15 years. And I hope not. I think hard landing, I think, the true meaning of hard landing will means that an economy have a sharp downturn and the trajectory and from fast growth to a very low growth within a relatively short period of time. And I do believe that a hard landing, it is something that the Chinese government will try to avoid at all cost. And because hard landing, for me, will be a bad news for China, as well as for the rest of the world. And it's funny that I think, as Huang Shan mentioned, that the new normal is now the buzzword in China, and everybody talking about it, and from president to premier and downward to the people on the streets. And actually, that term initially was used by a McKinsey report in 2009 in the aftermath of the eruption of the financial crisis. And initially means that the high-income countries now, basically the good days are over. But the Chinese leaders managed to actually turn this term with quite a negative correlation into something quite positive. One is new, and the second is normal. So I think that is a very Chinese way of creative usage of terms. So my feeling is that the Chinese government will try to rebalance in the economy, and we don't really know what exactly the true state of the economy at the moment. Maybe the truth is lying between the 7.4% and some of the much lower, more pessimistic assessment of the economy. But there's a couple of things that I can pick up. One is that the Chinese, I think the size of the Chinese economy should be able to absorb some of the shocks, and as we have seen in the past decade. And the Chinese government is very determined. And Ming-Xin mentioned about is not cyclical, but I think probably is both cyclical as well as structural. And there's a couple of things which the Chinese government will be very determined to do. One is try to generate the domestic consumption demand. And secondly, as we have seen that in a new context of a new road, new belt, maybe China is also now thinking of exporting some of the overcapacity to some of the areas that actually in need of such capacity, some of the manufacturing capacity. Premier Li Keqiang himself has been a super salesman for the Chinese railway equipment, I think, for the past 2 years. And also some of the sectors, for example, like IT sector and the e-commerce sector, I think China has already managed to make a global kind of a mark. And a company like Alibaba probably also signaling a kind of a new direction and for the kind of a new Chinese and economy. And also the government has now been so interested in making the Chinese economy more innovative. I'm not so sure whether China can achieve that. You know, I think on the one hand, we've seen that the Chinese leaders have been very confident in making that happen. On the other hand, we have seen, for example, every March, you know, in Beijing, we have the China High-Level Development Forum. Every year, I think the government is spending so much money in inviting almost 100 former political leaders as well as business leaders to provide a counsel. You know, I think still China is now still in the process of learning. And so there's a kind of for me, it's a very contradictory. On the one hand, you can see a more assertive and a more confident of China. On the other hand, the West, especially in the aftermath of the financial crisis, I think the West, especially the United States, is getting less confident and even relatively weaker. So it is that kind of a context by which China will manage its rise and its restructuring.
Oh, indeed, yesterday when former Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson was talking about his book, he recalled the time when, after the financial crisis, when he met the then Deputy Premier Wang Qishan, and the Deputy Premier said to him, "You are my teacher. But now, I don't think you are so smart anymore." So it is a confidence in China that is certainly a lot more assertive, and much more confident about themselves. But in talking about
can I also comment on this?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I would comment on this issue, hard landing or not. I think in the absence of structural reform, immediate structural reforms to rebalance the economy, China may end up with a very prolonged downward adjustment, which is not necessarily better than a case of hard landing. If we can look at chart 4 here, here I'm showing the excess investment in the Chinese economy. As of 2013, which is the latest data available, investment account for about 48% of GDP. This is way high no matter how you look at this. I mean, in the 70s, Japan, we saw a peak of 40%, and followed by multi-years, multi-decades of a slowdown afterward, particularly after the 1990s when the Japanese population started to age. By the way, China's population will also start to age right from this year, 2015. So if you compare with China's past, the previous peak was in 1948 at the level of 42.8%. But that was the year of great leap forward. So such a high level of investment will cast a big challenge for the Chinese economy. First, if we turn to the next page, the economy is heavily indebted. Now, China's debt to GDP ratio is about 243% compared to 153% 7 years ago. And a large part of that debt was owed by the SOEs and the local governments. And this sharp increase in debt has never been seen in many other countries in the past. And on the back of this, we are seeing, if we turn to chart 6, a massive decline in the efficiency of investment. This is the marginal product of capital in China, which fell by more than half over the past 7 or 8 years since the financial crisis in 2008. So I think right now the growth model is still pumping money into the economy to boost investment growth. But the thing is, the worst thing that could happen in China is continue to boost the economy through investment, because the more you invest, the higher the level of debt will be, and the more the redundancy or excess capacity in the economy will be. That will eventually lead to a multi-decade downward adjustment. The reason I don't think China would have this kind of a 1997-98 Asian financial crisis is that China's savings rate is still very high, and China's external debt is very low. So all the debt mainly is domestic debt. And China's financial system is not so open, so there is some capital flight, but it is still being subject to tight control.
Yeah.
So.
I just want to add one observation, is that people watching China are obsessed with the scenario of a heart attack, while they actually should be paying attention to the concept of cancer. Because what afflicts China today is a type of cancer which people in this room should be very familiar with. This is called massive misallocation of capital. And this has been going on for decades. And the current government, again, this is my own view, is not taking steps to address this fundamental problem. So if this goes on, we may not see an imminent implosion of the financial system, as Jimmy has just said, but we're seeing the spread of the cancers throughout the system.
Would you say that then, with this sort of an ailment, the normal actions that government would take, it's almost counterproductive? Because many people will say, oh, let's pump money into the system. But that's actually the wrong thing to do at this time. So everything you need to do is almost counterintuitive.
Yeah, I think China's policymakers are faced with a very difficult balance that they have to strike carefully. On the one hand, you don't want to see a too sharp slowdown in the short term, because that could explode the debt problem. And also the unemployment problem will also emerge, leading to social unrest. That's the last thing China wants to see. But at the same time, maintaining growth through investment may alleviate some of the short-term pressures, but at the cost of a bigger problem in the longer run. So it's a very difficult mission for China to complete.
I want to turn, sorry, Li-Fen, I want to turn now to the issue of the slowdown in the Chinese economy with something that is going on in China right now. You can call it a legal issue, or you can call it a political issue, which is President Xi Jinping's crackdown on corruption, which has been very strong. In many ways, especially in the service industry, for a long time it was buoyed up by a lot of spending by local governments or the government sector in restaurants and using hotels. And now, with this crackdown, there seems to be then a great care in not wanting to be seen to be so aspirational, wearing expensive watches, going to expensive places. So is this crackdown actually going to slow down the economy even more?
So actually, I think an unrelenting, high-profile anti-corruption campaign actually represents a significant break from the, we call business as usual. So the government, I think, now has put in place a lot of bold initiatives since the new government came into office in late 2012. But ironically, I would say the roadmap unveiled by this new government does not mitigate the controversies about the way ahead, but rather confounded the already existing controversy and the way forward. So I mean, by doing so, because each faction or each interest group can find things in their favor. For example, the leftist, and we call the conservatives in China's political terms, that they feel, well, the government wants to purify the party and wants to have we call the strengthen the political control over the state and the society. So they found a favorable thing in the statement of the government. But the liberals and the market-oriented guys also find the things to their taste. That means the government unveil very bold market-oriented approach toward the economy. For example, we say we must have allow the market forces to play a basic role in the allocating of the capital, things like that. So each faction or interest will find their favorable thing in this statement. So I would argue that starting from this, so I would say maybe I would say now we have seen a paradigm shift, but we need more details to show which way China's economy, China's state, and Chinese society will be heading.
Mm. What would you make of this crackdown on corruption? I mean, is it just a matter of President Xi wanting to put down his opponents? Is it as simple as that?
No, there are several ways of looking at the anti-corruption campaign. Clearly, it serves a very useful short-term political purpose for President Xi Jinping. A lot of his colleagues or his rivals have done something that's questionable, and he can use that to go after them, that's one. But I would say that we should look beyond the more easy explanations. President Xi is a very unusual leader. He genuinely has a sense of historical mission, and that is saving the Communist Party. Incidentally, one of his favorite movies is Saving Private Ryan, so I'm just drawing some loose connection between the two. He views himself as the only person who can prevent the Communist Party from repeating the tragedy, from his point of view, of the former Soviet Union. That the former Soviet Union collapsed because of corruption of its Communist Party. So he wanted to deal with that issue. And additionally, given his background, he's a so-called princeling. His father was one of the founding revolutionary heroes of the Communist Party. People of that lineage genuinely have a sense of ownership of the country. They believe the country is theirs, and they view corrupt officials as stealing from the family.
They are the managers.
The managers.
Yeah.
He's the owner. He's reappointed to be CEO chairman, and he comes into office and finds everybody, all the high hands are stealing from the family. So he has this very strong moral rage against corrupt officials.
Different.
I think based in China, reporting China, I think one thing which really, even for me as someone born and brought up in China, one thing which is different between the Chinese system and what we call the Western liberal democracy is that actually it is the Chinese government who is actually managing and controlling the economy. They are the managers of our gigantic economy. So my feeling is that there's a couple of things relates to anti-corruption campaign. And first of all, and I agree with what Ming-Shen has just said, I think President Xi Jinping himself see this is his mission to save the party in order to put China in a healthy sort of track. But due to the deficiency of the system, and also due to the perversity and the widespread bankruptcy and the corruption system issue in China, it's very difficult to avoid being selective. For example, I think most of the Chinese senior officials which has been deposed, they are all the number 2 or number 3 in the ministry, never number 1, because, you cannot actually avoid the whole campaign being selective. So I think the Chinese government and President Xi Jinping himself and the anti-corruption czar, and as Win just mentioned, the former premier Wang Qishan himself recognized that China has to move beyond actually launching a campaign which seems to be very selective. Whether China can actually move in beyond and to make sure the whole system is more accountable and the whole bureaucracy will be actually become more open, more transparent. And one other thing which I want to mention in relates to Win's question is that there are signs that the whole campaign, although has been extremely popular at the grassroots level, but it has really making the decision-making of the governance and the government and slow down quite a lot. And so for most of the officials, be it at the grassroots level, provincial level, even to some degree at the central government level, now they don't really know what to do. They have already get used to what we now maybe call old normal, but now it's new normal. They don't really know how to proceed.
So the best way is not to do anything.
I think there are signs that less contracts has been signed.
Yeah.
A lot of the projects which has been approved by central government nowadays are simply sitting there. So I hope this is a temporary issue that China is confronting. But otherwise, I think it will be a big problem. Because practically, if you actually as I mentioned earlier, that it is the Chinese Communist Party secretary who are now actually really running the economy. So if they're now sitting idly, nothing will happen.
Yeah. I want to read to you something that I just picked up last week. Well, last week, on the 20th of April, the People's Daily ran a commentary, and all those who follow China probably know what the People's Daily is. It is the organ of the Chinese Communist Party, and it's well known that over time, certain major policies, major ideas are floated in there in these columns to suggest maybe a new action. And all this has happened before. It is a commentary entitled Family Upbringing in the Leadership Cadre is not a private matter. Now, the English version of this article in the international media gave it a more direct headline. Basically, poor family upbringing is to blame for graft. And in the article, it said, it was exactly because of upbringing was not rigorous that allowed their homes, these are the corrupt officials, to become exchanges of power and money, converting their families into a community of special interests. Those following the old Chinese maxim of all in the family taking advantage of the promotion of one member to enrich themselves would find the upshot that they would all suffer in jail. Now, this appearing in the People's Daily, which is now talking about values. I wonder if I could ask the panel, what do you make of this? Is this a new move in the anti-corruption battle and using values as a way of doing it, but also addressing something that many observers of China have seen, that many values, the traditional family values of China, were in fact taken away through the different periods of Chinese history after the revolution in '49 and the Cultural Revolution, where many things happened which took away these family values, and also the values among the Communist Party cadre, which had the ideal, I'm there to serve the people. And President Hu Jintao himself in the past had said, my mission is to have the people as the center of everything. But now it is really doing something about it. I just wanted to throw the question to the panel.
Well, it's a difficult question. Let me just start by making two quick points. One is that this article highlights a very well-known practice in China. That is, you may call crony capitalism in one family.
Yes.
That is, officials and their children are all engaged in corrupt activities. But the second point is more serious. That is, for a long, long time after the end of the Maoist era, the Chinese Communist Party tried to give the officials, the rulers, the ruling elite some sense of political, physical security. And the rules after Mao's death was that their family would not be touched if the official falls for political reasons. What this says is to send out a signal, which has been backed by recent prosecutions, is that when an official falls from power, his family is not safe. This is actually a very, very serious development.
Yeah, I think, I'm in support of anti-corruption campaign in China. But at the same time, I kept thinking, why in the Chinese history there are so many episodes of corruption? If you go to Qing Dynasty, Ming Dynasty, and even before, China's history started with multi-centuries of corruption. Why this cannot be eradicated? I think, I don't have a complete answer, but I think establishing a system to prevent corruption is probably more efficient than waging a campaign against corruption. Because otherwise you're going to have this, in a circle that in the end you find that you're back to square one. Right? So I think that's why in China it is so important to govern the country through law, or rule the country by law, not just rule the country with the existing law. So it is imperative, I think, for China to move along these ways in order to completely eradicate corruption in the future. And another thing I would want to comment is the economic or financial implications of anti-corruption campaign. As an economist or strategist, I tend to look at the issues more carefully. Now, I think China is at a moment that consumption is needed to rebalance the economy. But the anti-corruption campaign, which is needed, will inevitably lead to some deceleration in certain consumption products or services, like the high-end luxury goods, like casino operators. So that's why in the short term, it could, to a degree, aggravate the imbalance problems in China. That's one point I want to make. Then another point I want to make is maybe as an investor at this stage, better stay away from the high-end luxury operators. There are a lot of companies in this area that did very well in the past, but recently we start to see their revenue profit falling down quite sharply. So we may wish to stay away from these sectors. And at the same time, we know in order to offset this negative factor on growth, China is promoting other sectors to grow faster, like healthcare, telecom, travel, tourism, entertainment, financial services. These are the sectors that are doing very well, actually much better than in the past. And we saw their share prices are rising, and I think the rooms for further increase is still there.
So I just want to jump in some words. I think now the new leadership has developed kind of inclination to go back to the old wisdom to find inspiration to deal with what we call 21st century challenges. So they trying to go to the basic unit of our society, the family. We're trying to go to the family value to deal with these challenges. And also, I think, they don't want to leave. They want to leave no stone unturned. That means we first, we can learn lessons from the Western world, right? When we also learn lessons from the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Soviet blocs. But also, we can go back to traditional Chinese wisdom to find inspiration for this. So I think it's sort of reflect kind of the difficulty and the dire situation that now our leadership faced, because everybody knows that the challenge, we call it low-lying fruits, have been picked. Now the reform has entered, we call it deep water. That means there are a lot of vested interest and interest groups staying in the way of reform, SOEs, local governments. So each single player, each single faction, they try their best to block the reform agenda. So you have no other choice but to try whatever you can find to find a solution to navigate what we call uncharted waters.
So can I just...
Different, please.
Yeah, in relation to your, the People's Daily editorial, it seems to me that, you know, given the seriousness of the corruption situation in China, especially almost across all levels of bureaucracy, and probably I think, you know, it's time for top leaders to think that even the party discipline itself, even I think the punishment at the moment is very severe, will not be able to contain the problem. So maybe I think we have to still go back to the 5,000 long Chinese civilization and to see whether something can be used, which is Confucius, I think.
Yeah.
Although during the Cultural Revolution, Confucius was labeled as the enemy of the establishment.
Right.
But now there are increasing signs that I think the leaders are actually using, you know, Confucianism, Buddhism, even some of the other religious and elements to see whether they will be able to put China as a society in a more sort of ordinary manner. I think the current anti-corruption campaign has made the wives of many high-level officials very happy. But, you know,
them at home.
All officials, not just
I think all officials, at least their husband will be returned home on time and having a dinner and with the family together. And actually, I think the anti-corruption campaign has made certain families in China, especially officials' family, a lot more harmonious. So
family values.
Family values.
That's right.
Yes.
I want to turn to the last topic, which is actually a more foreign policy related topic, because many people have been talking about a new assertiveness in Chinese foreign policy, pointing to the South China Sea and the competing claims between China and quite a number of other countries in Southeast Asia for the different islands there. But at the same time, this other 3 projects that the Chinese government have announced, which have not been called assertive and could even be interpreted by the countries that benefit from this to say that this is something helpful. May I have map number 11, please? Chart 11. This is the map of what China has called the One Belt, One Road project. It is the New Silk Road economic belt, which runs all the way to Austria, through Central Asia, and the other one is the Maritime Silk Route, which reaches into Africa as well. And here it is putting in a large amount of money to build the infrastructure of the different places along the way. Now, naturally, those countries that are in this region, not all of them are very wealthy, they would welcome the sort of investments that will come to improve their infrastructure. And of course, you've also heard about the creation of an AIIB, which stands for the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which China has committed $50 billion, and with the other 57 countries going to see when the Articles of Association are finalized, they would also contribute an equivalent amount of $50 billion to help in infrastructure projects in Asia, because the World Bank has calculated that this part of the world will need $9 trillion worth of infrastructure project over a 10-year period, which is a lot of money. So, but it's how to finance it. Now, of course, this issue has been a little bit controversial because Japan and the United States has chosen not to participate at this point of time in the AIIB. But I wanted to ask the panel, is China in fact becoming more assertive, or do you see them as trying to exercise positive leadership for these neighboring countries as affected by this One Road, One Belt, as well as the Asia Investment Infrastructure Bank? Stephen?
Okay, on the issue of One Belt, One Road, and also in connection with the AIIB, I think my sort of first take is that probably, for the past 2.5 decades, that China has been the factory of the world, basically manufacturing physical goods. So I think it should be given credit for actually this time actually attempt to make some conceptual efforts, actually give some new thinking and some contribution towards the public goods. But my feeling is that probably it's too early for China to actually take on such a gigantic project. And many observers in the West has duped this one as the China's Marshall Plan. So I don't really know, given the diversity of countries, that one road and one belt will actually passing through. And I really doubt. I think China has been very comfortable in dealing with anything bilateral. For big projects, initially involve 56 countries. My feeling is that, probably it's a bit too early. But on the issue of AIIB, and I listened to the head of the interim group representing China, and I find that China has now been very clear, So on the issue of being assertive and also assertive, I think, because the geopolitical footprint of China now has become so large, China has been shy away from limelight for so long. Now I think probably it has come to the term that it cannot actually avoid that role. So my feeling is that China now is really putting his future international role now onto a very practical, I wouldn't believe that even a year ago, and President Xi Jinping will be willing to meet Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, when Japan hasn't actually made any real concession in terms of apologizing for his war record during the Second World War. So I see that this is a kind of a new sign. China wants to be practical, because China knows that it will have to deal with the complexity of global affairs, and sometimes it has to take itself back and rethink about his overall design of his role.
Wang Shan?
So instead of use the word assertiveness, I would love to say China has demonstrated greater willingness to flex its muscle, to leverage its influence when it feels uncomfortable with the status quo or current economic or financial arrangement. So it's more willing to show his voice and allow his voice to be heard. The second thing about the AIIB and lots of initiatives, I would argue that, so I think it represents kind of a steep learning curve of China. So if you look at China's overseas trip, the Go Abroad campaign starting from late 1990s, so we have seen the important role of China's biggest policy bank called China Development Bank. And according to statistics, just last 2 years, the amount of money Chinese Development Bank pumped in Latin America exceeded all the stock, of the money issued and loaned by Exim Bank, Export and Import Bank of America. So you can see China's state money is everywhere, especially sometimes in the we call backyard of the United States. But you can see Chinese money overseas actually is create a lot of controversy because people criticize we don't pay attention to the social and the environmental standards, and we don't practice we don't follow through the best practice approach. So I think that's why I would call the AIIB and other initiatives as the version 2.0 of Chinese Development Bank. So that means we make it more legitimate and more credible with the introduction of the new members and the new, we call the standardized practice. So that means we can make it China's face and Chinese money overseas more acceptable to recipients and more acceptable to international stakeholders locally.
Jiming. Yeah, I think this One Belt, One Road initiative and also the AIIB idea are interrelated, and they are to China's own interest, I think. As I mentioned before, that China is suffering from huge overcapacity problems, and China also wants to create more export markets, given that the traditional export markets like the US and Europe economies are growing at a much slower pace compared to the pre-crisis period. So more export market is needed, and there's a need to digest overcapacity, domestic overcapacity problems. So by building infrastructure, helping to build infrastructure in this new Silk Road or the Maritime Silk Road, China hope this could digest part of the like a steel overcapacity problems, like a cement and power. So China's construction companies could also go to these countries to export related services. And to finance that, there are already two initiatives, I think. One is the AIIB, the other is the Silk Road Fund, another $40 billion US. So this is in China's own interest from an economic point of view. Another thing is here, China's currently export relies a lot on the Strait of Malacca. So China wants to diversify away from the use of that water transportation channel and open another inland channel so that the exports channels could be secured or more balanced. So from a strategic point of view, I think there's also a point in that.
Thanks, Jimmy. I'm sorry, I wanted to leave a couple of minutes for
okay, I'll make it very quick.
I'll give you the last word.
Okay, happy to have the last word. If this is what we mean by assertiveness, then we should have more of it, because the effects on the global economy will be largely positive. Asia and the rest of the world do need more infrastructure. My worry is that this is being hyped to an unrealistic degree. China should paraphrase what Teddy Roosevelt said, carry a big wallet, but walk quietly. Right? Second one is that China has not thought through the financial operational risks involved in these very complex, difficult, long-term projects. So at the end of the day, I think we should just wait and watch and hope China will get some of the good deeds done, and then also want China not to be overly optimistic about the probability of success.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jiming, Wang Shan, Prof, and Li Fen, and thank you very much for spending the afternoon with us. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.